The book is the history of a previously unknown financial conspiracy that I discovered that occurred in the state of Missouri at the outset of the American Civil War. And the plot backfired, but it wound up having an ever-worsening series of consequences that eventually bankrupted a large segment of Missouri's pro-Confederate population, and that has had reverberations to this day. In Missouri, this was the worst instance of guerrilla violence, protracted guerrilla violence in American history, before, since, or during the Civil War. And the question ever since has been why. That should have been so. The book provides an answer for that. Also, why Missouri, alone among the slave states after the war, pretty much distanced itself from the South and wound up affiliating instead with the North. It's the only slave state that did that. Third, on the national scene, it gives a picture of an archaic form of military mobilization that was used at the outset of the Civil War and for all of America's previous wars, but never again since that time. And that has not been studied before either until now. I'd have to say no. Missouri is on the western periphery, was on the western periphery of the war, and as the war dragged on, it became kind of a dumping ground for military commanders who'd failed to perform well in the eastern theater of the war. But having said that, the violence there was so spectacular and kind of over the top that it's never been forgotten, and it has become kind of a very large part of the public consciousness. American shared memory of the war, if you will. And besides that, the war on the border and guerrilla violence during the Civil War are very current topics in Civil War scholarship these days. In Missouri, it was very significant that all along the frontline states, the middle border between the two hostile sections of the country, there was guerrilla violence. But the difference between what you might call this normal level of guerrilla violence and the excessive guerrilla violence in Missouri turns out to be attributable to the additional people who joined the guerrillas from the ranks of the people who had lost their land. There was more guerrilla violence in Missouri because there were more guerrillas, and there were more guerrillas because of this additional grievance, what had happened to them. Well, three things, really. First of all, the number of recorded incidents, which was far and away more than those in any other state that had guerrilla violence. Second, just the extreme viciousness of it. Missouri guerrillas rode with scalps on their bridles. They mutilated corpses, decapitated dead men, and set heads on fence posts, that kind of thing. Thirdly, the duration. The violence in Missouri didn't settle down for a good 20 years after the war had formally ended. Into the 1870s, Eastern newspapers called Missouri the robber state because of the excessive violence and chaos that still prevailed there. Well, it might. In the case of guerrilla violence, the Missouri guerrillas are the most studied such group in all American history. But even so, the evidentiary sources that I wound up looking at, which is to say financial and judicial records and extended family connections among the participants, had not been looked at. So even for this much studied group, if that was true, then this may be true in other cases as well, and it would be well to go back and take a look and just see if there's anything there in the cases of other civil wars and insurgencies. For me, it's been further evidence of something that I have thought for some time, namely that there are fads in the way history is studied, both in what historians consider important and the kind of evidentiary sources that they look at. And right now, at least, it seems to me that financial data sources and also extended family links. Extended family as 19th century people would have understood it, namely incorporating a much larger group, do not receive the attention that they deserve. And certainly those will be things I'll be looking at in anything that I study in the future.